Welcome back to the Maverick Ag 2.0 webinar series. Obviously, I'm doing a couple back to back here, so I just did the introduction one. So I'm hoping that people, if you haven't seen it, jump over, have a look at webinar series one. I tried to put out as much good stuff as we can, but we did say we wanted to put out a few of these at once. So I'm going to cover another one of the blogs and topics that we have. It's the easiest place for me to get information. Plus, it's kind of real time because they're written as the industry and as the growing season moves. So I'm trying to be as relevant as I can based on the current occurrences in agriculture. So the big one, obviously today. Now, when this gets released, it might not still be an issue, but I have a feeling it'll still be there. And if it's not, there's still going to be some good information to take out of this. The big one was the last couple of weeks, we've seen some really steep commodity dives. And I've said before, I don't usually talk agronomy and marketing, so I'm going to stay out of too in depth on the marketing side. Because honestly, I don't do any of the hedging or the forward pricing on our farm. I do the budgets and I do some of the cost of productions, and I'm the one who gives them the information they need to make those decisions. So that's where I'm going to come from on this webinar, more or less from the internal side and the planning side. Whereas in the actual execution, I stay away from the hedging account because A, there's way more risk and I don't like spending Christian's money that way. And B, on the marketing side, Jeff's his history and his past with Viterra gives him a lot higher leg up than me. And honestly, it's something that I'm not interested in or passionate about. So I don't mind giving the roadmap. I just don't want to be the one driving it. So the big one and the blog I wrote was called Could've, Should've, Would've. And again, hindsight's 2020, guys. We didn't do everything right. Nobody ever does. But the blog itself is written from a standpoint of what could we have done to avoid some of the stresses, some of the mental health issues, and some of the profitability loss that we're going to see based on these commodity prices. I mean, I'm not sure about some of the US guys listening, but in Canada right now, yields wise, there's going to be some farms that have really good yields this year, some farms that don't. But the biggest thing is, even with good yields, the drop in commodity prices has probably brought us back down to a below average crop. And from that standpoint, and I know the US with soybeans and corn where they are right now, it's looking even worse from there. And I'm sure and I might botch these statistics, so don't write them down, but I'm sure I read an article last week where they're predicting somewhere in that 40% range of drop in revenue in the States with a 12% increase in costs. So, I mean, I have a feeling that you're probably worse off than even we are at this point. Not saying we're not on a trend towards that, but the big thing with this webinar is more or less just the discussion part. And what I mean by that is a proper plan would not have saved you from this, but a proper plan definitely would have put a few things in your head and maybe taken some of the stress out of it by having a percentage. So I'm a huge advocate of Dr. Cole. I've seen him down at TPAP. I've seen him present a few other times, and maybe not on the thought leadership part, but on the actual presenting and what he's saying, it's a very well-rounded approach to what I call reducing risk. You might call it marketing. I call it risk reduction. So from that standpoint, his opinion is that if you always shoot for the highs, you're in trouble. You're never going to get the highs. Nobody's got a crystal ball. Hindsight's 2020. It's easy to say, oh, that one year I hit the high, I'm just going to keep going for it. It's about taking profit when it's there. And it's a very hard mindset, guys. This isn't something you learn real quick. I mean, I would like to say that I wasn't a greedy farmer when I was farming, but I was. I'm no different than anybody else. You always try to get the high because the last thing you want to do is sell and watch the price go up because, oh, I made a mistake. Well, you need to get that out of your mindset right away. It's never a mistake if you made the decision with the information you had. So for us, that's where we start our planning is gather the information, create a plan, put it into action of where we're going to actually make some trades. What's the number? Because without that start, and I mean, if you look at the TPAP stats, 60% of farms don't even have that starting point because they don't know their cost of production. So from that standpoint, you need to know what the starting point is. And that might not have to be as detailed as we are, but from my standpoint, if you don't have an idea of what your cost of production is, at least per acre, you're in trouble. And for most guys, I'm trying to push them down to the per bushel because that's how you create your marketing plan off the start. It's not based on where the market's going to be at harvest time or in the spring. It's literally based on the cost of production today. What do I need to sell for to A, break even, and then B, to hit my return on investment that I want? And for us, we shoot for 20%. It's an albatross number. It seemed to be the number on the benchmarks when I was in public accounting with M&P that was kind of the number that you wanted to hit. So for us, we shoot for 20%. And I mean, based on interest rates today of 7, that's a 13% jump. I'm okay still expanding and still buying land and still putting stuff down at 7% interest as long as I hit my 20% ROI. So from that standpoint, that's our starting point. So for us on a barley, canola, wheat rotation, using 10-year average yields, don't lie to yourself. I mean, that's the one issue I have with a lot of farms that come to me is they like to jump on yields, whether it's, oh, I'm fertilizing for this, or I really think I can grow this. Well, no, let's go back to your 10-year yields and take your 10-year yields, because that's what you've proven. If it's better, great. It actually means we have an easier time selling later. But for now, let's grab your 10-year yields. Let's identify a fixed cost of production for those 10-year yields. So for us, and these are just numbers I'm throwing out, I wanted to say barley was somewhere in that 588 range based on our average yields, canola in that 1250 range, and wheat was probably in the 9s, which scares me a bit because we never actually hit 9s, or at least not for very long. So from that standpoint, I now know our break evens. The other thing we do then is we take a 20% return and say, okay, in order to hit our 20% return budget, here's the number. So are we going to sell 100% of the crop of that? No. A, way too much risk. B, I still want to play in some upside if there's a possibility. So we're going to take some of the risk off the table real quick. And honestly, for some farms, that real quick means the summer before. When I start booking fertilizer in June, July for next year's crop, I'm looking at markets that far out to see if I can lock in the actual margin. Because if you can lock in the margin at that point, the risk is reduced. I know my fixed costs, an estimate at least based on historical, as long as I don't go out and buy 10 new X9 combines or whatever the number might be. But if my fixed costs are somewhat fixed, I have an idea on those already. And the moment I lock in my fertilizer, I've locked in the majority of my input expense. I now know what that number is. And if I can hit that number back in the summer, I book it. I take a percentage. I don't know whether that's 5, 10, 15, 20. You have to have that plan to you. But you're locking it in at a 20% return at that point. If you can, I'm gonna sleep at night. I'm not looking to say, oh, but it went up to $20 and I lost $4 worth of profit. No, I locked in with the information I had at the point I made it. I locked in my profit at 20%. I'm happy. I'm sleeping fine. And I didn't lock it all in. I still have the ability to play on the upside, but for now, there's where I am. And don't get me wrong, we can go into puts, options, all that other stuff. But honestly, for now, let's leave that away because I'm not the expert at that and I don't want to be. So that's kind of our starting point. Now, the interesting part is, what do you do with a crop like wheat this year? For us in Western Canada, wheat was under our cost of production from day one. Now, this is where I would say we made some mistakes this year, and that's a leadership group mistake because we make all decisions as a group. Should we have sold a little bit while it was sitting around that $9 range? Yes. And we'd have sold into a loss, which is really hard to do. But across the entire farm, we'd already locked in probably a 30% profit because prices were actually higher than our 20%, which means we could actually sustain a little bit of loss on the wheat side and still hit our target for the whole farm. Maybe not per crop, but for the whole farm. That's a very powerful tool because that gives us the ability to make those marketing decisions and not rely on gut, because gut says don't sell into a loss. Most guys will never sell into a loss if they know that number. Some guys don't know that number, so they're selling and they don't realize they're at a loss. For us, we should have sold at that point to lock in some of the down potential. Now, as wheat hits the 7s and 6s, hindsight's 2020. I can now tell you the overall farm, I don't think I can sell for 6 something and still hit that 20% return that I want on the overall farm without some big yield jumps, which we're starting to see on the cereals as we combine. But for now, wheat's going to sit in the bin until I see something change or until I have more information, which would be post-harvest yields. So until I get more information, I'm not moving anything. I'm not freaking out. I'm not jumping on the train if I got to start clearing it. We had our working capital set up, so cash flow wise, we know our requirements. I'm not at a point where I need to sell. Now, some farms aren't going to have this freedom, let's call it. If working capital is tight and you've got no ability to open up more credit for let's call it a bump or whatever you want to call it on the operating side, to survive some of these months during the harvest pressure, then yeah, you're going to sell into a loss just to get cash flow. And that's not a good position, but it's a position you're in and you have to deal with it. So we've put the seed in the ground. We're running through summer. Now what do we do? Well, we've created tools and resources, and some of them will be through the Maverick Ag 2.0 brand. You're going to have the opportunity to see them, to use them. If you're, part of our network and part of our webinar series stuff that we're pushing out here. But what we do is we have an updated calculator that literally after seeding, the inputs, the fixed expenses are all kind of locked now. Where, don't get me wrong, we could buy some machinery, fuel price could go up. There is changes that will happen, but we have an idea. And as we go and as we get into some of the fields, we start adjusting yields. And this calculator, as we adjust yields, adjusts our break even, then it adjusts a whole bunch of our 20% returns, 10%. It gives us an idea. So now if we're into our barley and it looks like it's, 15 to 20 bushel higher than what we budgeted, so we're doing well on the cereals, all of a sudden that cost of production and that 20% return drops. So now I don't need to sell it for $7, which I can't get. Now with the new bushels, I actually only need to sell it for $5.50. Well, yeah, barley went below 6 and everybody says, oh, I'm closing the bins, I'm not selling. For us, it still made sense. It still got us our 20% return because of the yield. So we actually turned around and sold, I want to say 8,000 ton. And by doing that, we've now locked in our 20% return, which I'm happy with. And we've reduced any more downside risk, because if we're getting these yields, my assumption is that a few farms, not a few, a significant portion of Western Canada is probably going to see some good cereals. Obviously, pulse and canola are a different story right now, and as we see that oversupply in Western Canada, it's just going to push more pressure on the price. So why wouldn't we take our profit off the table today and move on? The other thing it does, we just created a whole bunch of cash flow because the elevators are willing to sell it at this right now. We hauled a whole bunch into the elevator right off the combine. It now fixed some cash flow issue, which allows me to do one thing that I really want to do, not sell any wheat. So it's this planning and these discussions that become quite critical in the whole stage of the whole growing season that most people overlook. And not overlook, they know it, but a lot of people still market on gut feel or trying to hit the highs or feeling guilty, or the worst one is, I like to say farmers have a very short memory, because what happens is we say the new norm. Well, the new norm for canola is 15. Well, I'm not selling at 12 because the new norm is 15. Well, if you go back to 2017, 18, we were selling at 950. So who created the new norm? Well, we did. And then if you go even further, you have the discussions on when should you sell wheat? What's the, based on historicals, if you go back to 30-year historicals, when should you be selling grains? And it's not off the combine. It's spring, it's summer, the following year. Literally selling grain is now a 24-month process. When we start buying in June, July, the year before our inputs, that's when the sales season starts for the following year. And honestly, we hold right through till probably right before harvest. And some will have a few birthdays, which I don't like seeing grain sit in the bin for a birthday, but when it happens, it happens. But for us, we have 24 months to sell that grain. We don't have 12. And I think that's often overlooked because a lot of the aging farm population never got into marketing. We never had to. We had the Canadian Wheat Board. We didn't have a free open market. And that's why there's still complaints about having the free market, but it's an education component. And I think Christian said it on one of the podcasts we recorded lately. If you're looking at education when it comes to agriculture, make sure there's a marketing course in there, because growing grain is honestly only a third of the equation. The other third is marketing and the other third is management. And without having all three of those, or some education or an expert at least hired in some of those areas, you're not going to do it. And I mean, I've heard lots of complaining on Twitter and even complaining to myself about certain marketing, oh, my guy should have made this sale and didn't, and I'm angry at him. They're going off the same stuff that we are. The only thing that I would argue is that you need to make sure that all your advisors speak together. And from that perspective, I deal with a lot of clients we give them the same numbers that I'm telling you about today. I've only had one or two or a handful of marketing guys for clients reach out and ask for those costs. So literally the marketing guy is not talking to the CFO and budget who has all the cost of production information, which should give them their marketing plan. So then my fail-safe answer is, what are you marketing to? You don't even have the numbers. And if you're just getting the numbers from the farmer's brain, they're wrong. I'm sorry. I have some farmers that can estimate real close, but they're not right. So the big one there is that your advisor group has to be in cohesion. And that's from your accountants to your lawyers, to the marketer, to the agronomist, to whatever group you have together. They all got to talk. And if there's an ego in the room, get rid of it. Because I've dealt with enough accountants that like to go toe to toe with me. One of us can't be here. I don't want that relationship, and I honestly will lose. I'll drop a client if that's what it comes to, because we're all trying to do what's best for the client. And if one of us has an ego or a brain in there that means that we have to be in charge, that's not best for the client. We've already failed as an advisor. So keep that in the back of your head. So not to go too far down the tangent, but just having a look here, what else I kind of talked about in the blog itself. Some will argue that this is a big farm mentality standpoint. It's a lot easier to market a lot more grain. You get better price. It's not. I deal with clients from 500 acres in the coaching programs all the way up to our farm, which is one of the bigger ones I have, which is 42,000. It doesn't change. Cost of production for your farm is no different than my farm, is no different than a 500 acre farm. Like that's the commonality. The commonality is that the per acre or the per bushel costs are individual to your operation. So this is not a big farm mentality. It doesn't apply to my small family farm. That doesn't work. These are numbers that every farm, whether it's a hobby farm, whether you have, whether you're working off farm job and you're just doing this, a couple quarters here and there, you still need to know these numbers. And it surprised me quite a bit being down at TPAP, hearing, their stats of how many don't. And I'm not surprised. I mean, we still have a lot of operations on the cash accounting side in both Canada and the US. So it doesn't surprise me that you can't find an accrual cost of production, because nobody knows what an accrual number is. And even on webinars, when I'm talking cash versus accrual in the US, it's a foreign concept. So, I mean, we have a long ways to go as an industry. And I've said this in the past webinar, we're still really far behind. So we need to catch up, and we need to get operations to the point where they have the real accrual information. And it doesn't have to be month by month by month like we do. I mean, I've got 2 CPAs on staff between Christian and I. I'm expecting our numbers to be, more real time, more relevant than a lot of farms. But from your standpoint, once you have your statements for last year, you've got your estimate of fixed costs. Yes, there's going to be some changes based on capital, and let's call it 10 to 20 bucks an acre can make a difference, but we don't have to be perfect. This initial marketing plan needs to be close. The other one is, your inputs, what you're going to put down. So now your fixed costs, your inputs, your 10-year average yields. You essentially can have this cost of production figured out October, November, once you're done combining from last year. It's not a hard concept. And that's when we should be selling. So literally you now have papers in front of you when you're making sales on the futures for the following year. So again, that's I'm in 19 minutes here on this, but I don't want to drag a dead horse too far here, but the answer is treat it like a business. And I've said this a million times. And on this standpoint, when we're talking marketing, you need to know the information. And that's not just coming from an accountant. That's coming from a guy that did farm. That's coming from a guy who runs a lot of the budgeting for one of the large scale grain farms in the province. You need to know the numbers to make the proper marketing, and don't wait for the highs. If you wait for the highs, you're also going to hit the lows. And so that's the webinar series, Maverick Ag 2.0, coming out this fall. Look for the farmer coach cohorts. We've launched a few more this fall. There's a young farmer one that's only a 1 day, so there's a lot less commitment, but it does get you into some of the stuff we're talking about on these webinars. You get to see some of our concepts from a 30,000 foot picture, and it might get you excited. And obviously we hope that it brings you into our executive program and in the future into our master's program, because all of these things we talk about are relevant today, tomorrow, in the future. They're not going away. So for us, it's how do we get to more people? How do we share our stories? And honestly, this webinar series is one of the ways. So again, thank you for listening. That is the Maverick Ag 2.0 webinar series.